Having good aim is arguably the most important mechanic when it comes to zero build, but most players are focusing on aim training, which can actually hurt your aim. So in this video, I will cover 6 tips that will actually improve your aim in close and long range combat, including the aim routine that I use on a daily basis. Before we get started, dropping a like on this video would greatly help me grow, and if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. So the first tip is about how to properly choose the right sensitivity. Many players tend to copy other pros and mess around with their settings way too much, and it may be the main reason your aim is not going anywhere. Copying other people's settings is good and all, but what if your desk is smaller, or maybe you like to use your wrists more than your arm? Well, let me help you determine the best sensitivity for you, whether you're on a mouse and keyboard or controller. For the mouse and keyboard players, I want you to jump into any creative map and do the following to determine your best sensitivity. Ping somewhere on the map and make a full 360 until your crosshair reaches that point. If you still have more room on your desk, you can lower your sensitivity to make yourself more accurate. Do this until you have used up almost all of your space. If you couldn't make a full 360 and you had no more room, you will have to increase your sensitivity. The goal is to adjust your sensitivity to the point where you can use up as much space as possible and make a full 360. Now, if you use your wrist more, your sensitivity will be on the higher end, and you want to play around with a similar idea and test the range of your wrist to where it feels most comfortable. Do not look for best sensitivity settings online and set your own, because this is truly how your aim will perform best at your specific setup. Now for my controller players, you will do the opposite of what a mouse and keyboard player would do. I actually want you to find some controller players that are really good and find their settings. I believe some of the best controller players I know linked in the description. On a controller, it is most important to simply pick some settings and force yourself to learn them, because it is much harder to set up a perfect sensitivity on a controller. So whether you're a keyboard and mouse or a controller player, stop changing your settings 3 times a week. Your aim will never progress if you are consistently changing your settings. Moving on to tip number 2, we're going to talk about centering. This is a concept that many players don't know about or do not understand the full concept of. To fully explain, let me jump into a creative map made by Toby Shinobi. Any maps I use will have codes for them in the description below. So centering simply means centering my crosshair to where I think an enemy player is going to be. So instead of running around and looking at a random spot, I will constantly focus on putting my crosshair where I think an opponent could potentially be. The concept is to minimize the amount of movement you have to do to make your aim much more accurate. This is actually utilized in close range combat and has helped me win way more shotgun fights, especially in situations where you or your opponent is spamming their movement item. Let me break down a fight where Thieves utilize this very well. Here he pushes a player in a bunker with the void. As he jumps here with the sword, you can see him placing his shotgun crosshair to be perfectly on track to where the opponent is going to peek. And he does this before every shot that he takes, and he's able to hit very hard hitting shots because of it. If he were not centered on the opponent, he would be forced to flick, in which case most players are simply less accurate when having to flick, and even if he hit his shots while flicking, he's likely to not hit all his shotgun pellets, meaning he would output less damage per shot. Centering is also important when you are pre-aiming a right peek, sliding out of a corner, getting out of a car, and so many more scenarios which we will cover in a later tip. So when you ask the question of how all these players are hitting hard hitting shots and you seem to be hitting for nothing, 90% of the time this is why. When centering, you are simply more accurate than having to flick onto a target, and this leads to tip number 3, flicking versus tracking. Flicking is a mechanic where you have to rapidly flick to a target that is not already on your crosshair, and this happens very often in shotgun fights, and even with great centering, you will still run into situations where you will have to flick, such as opponents that may suddenly appear out of nowhere, or someone fighting you with a typhoon blade and you are having to flick as they change directions and maneuver throughout the fight. And this is one of the only times where I would actually say that practicing flicking can be a waste of time, because the truth is, this is a mechanic that takes a little bit of luck and is very situational. And if you are spending all your time on practicing your flicks, you're practicing for a part of the game that only happens when someone jumps at you out of nowhere. Now, if you still want to get a little bit of practice for it, here is a map I use for all my aim training. The map has great flicking and tracking options. You can test them out for yourself, or you can also use grid shot in aim labs or Kovacs if that is available to you. I would recommend using a shotgun since you are mostly going to have to flick in those scenarios more often, but focus on starting out slowly. The most important thing I can say about aim training is that accuracy is much more important than speed, and speed will improve over time as your accuracy increases. So start slow and then test your limits, but again, do not spend too much time trying to improve your flicking, because your time can be much better spent on tracking. Tracking happens mostly in mid to long range situations, but don't get it twisted, it can occasionally happen in close range combat. But why is it more important than flicking? When it comes to flicking, there's simply more of an element of luck that happens, and it often happens in emergency situations, whereas tracking happens way more often and is so much more important when it comes to opening up a fight, because it is much much more predictable and happens all the time, practicing your tracking is so much more important. So you can hop into that same map and go into the tracking section and practice there. I like to practice targets that are constantly changing direction, as it is the closest you will get to an in-game scenario, so I use aim labs for practice like this. Now I know I opened this video by saying that aim training could make you worse, and all of a sudden I'm telling you to do it. Before watching this video, I guarantee that some of you simply look for good maps to train on and simply assume that doing all the aim routines is going to help you. But if you don't focus on things like centering, flicking, and tracking, you are just wasting your time. I say all of this to say that while aim training can be important, it is at the bottom of my priority list, and the best way to practice is by actually getting into an in-game scenario and understanding how each weapon works. And this leads us to the next tip, where I will cover shotgun versus spray weapons. Aiming with these guns is very different, and while we covered flicking and tracking, we have to understand the difference between shotgun fights and AR or SMG fights. With shotguns, we do not have to worry about recoil. However, with SMGs and ARs, we do. So one thing you can do to improve recoil control is learn to single tap your AR. Even if you're doing it rapidly, simply single tapping and not holding your shoot button down will improve your aim with the AR dramatically. Shotguns are not as hard hitting this season, so hip firing is very important when it comes to close range fights, since you will likely have to use your spray weapons to finish up the fight. Now, the best way to practice with using the right weapons at the right time is to matchmake into this creative map in 1v1s or 2v2s and focus on the following. When you are in the face of your opponent, always focus on shooting one shotgun shot and switching to your spray weapon to follow up. When you shoot your shotgun shot, there is a delay between your second shot, so it can be very useful to instantly have a second weapon. And then a lot of times I like to spray about half of the clip and instantly switch back to my shotgun because the cooldown is now over and you can simply use your shotgun again. So the pattern in most of my close range fights is one shotgun shot, about a half a clip of my AR, followed up with one more shotgun shot, which generally finishes up the fight. The best way to practice is to 1v1 in maps, because you can get into the most amount of fights possible in a very short amount of time, as opposed to committing to an entire battle royale game and maybe getting into only 8 to 10 fights within 20 to 30 minutes. The more you fight, the better you will be at utilizing your aim in real game scenarios. But depending on your region, you may not be able to always matchmake against another player, and I'll tell you what you can do when I talk about my warm-up routine as an alternative. But before we get there, let's talk about why movement is part of your aim. One of the most underlooked things when it comes to aiming is that the way you move your character affects your aim more than you might think. So the first thing is sprinting. When you are sprinting, you are not holding your gun out, and this can oftentimes get you killed. For example, you may be sprinting at another player, you got weak, so you rush him while sprinting, and then he gets a free shot on you to even out the fight. But had you held your shotgun out while rushing him and maybe hit a short sprint into a slide, you can use centering to pre-aim his peak so that when he does peek you for a shot, you can now shoot without having a pullout time, which could cost you the fight. Take this example of me eliminating someone who dealt absolutely no damage to me because he was just sprinting the whole time and not holding his gun out. So again, work on timing your sprints to when you know your opponent is not looking for a shot on you. Other times you cannot shoot your weapons is when you hurdle or mantle onto something. The amount of times I've died due to the fact that I decided to mantle right in front of my opponent's face is countless. So when fighting someone and you need to mantle, consider observing your area and seeing if you have other options to avoid taking damage. Because just like sprinting, anytime you cannot have your gun out is a time your opponent has a free shot on you. It's practically like running around in the open without any weapons. Now, when doing other movements like sliding or jumping, make sure you abide by the second tip and focus on centering to minimize having to flick. I will have a full guide out soon on how you can read opponents' tendencies, helping you know when to use certain movement mechanics in a fight. And now, moving on to the reason many of you clicked on this video, we will be going over my aim training routine. The first thing I like to do before I even get into a game is watch other streamers dominate lobbies. This warms up my critical thinking and helps me get into the mindset of combat. Then when I load up the game, I like to warm up in a rapid 1v1 or 2v2 map I showcased earlier. Whilst focusing on everything we talked about with shotgun and AR aim, I usually try to win 2 rounds in a row before I call it a day. Now, a lot of times I don't feel like playing rapid 1v1s, and depending on your regions, you may not be able to find lobbies. I recommend loading into solo reload games, and this does wonders for me because I really get into a rhythm of constantly fighting, really warming up those in-game aim scenarios. Now, I prefer ranked reload myself, but pubs can be just as useful as well. And then finally, I hop into whichever mode I want to play for the day, which is usually 0-build pubs or 0-build ranked. Notice how my routine does not include aim training whatsoever, and I guarantee that if you ask any great 0-build players about their routines, they will tell you that they do not even warm up. I of course understand that some of you may really struggle with aim and need to touch up on certain things, in which case I would recommend using the aim trainer Keviiner map that I showcased earlier, and maybe implementing 5 to 10 minutes of tracking and flicking into your warm-up. If you made it this far into the video, make sure to subscribe to join the most underrated zero build community on YouTube. YouTube also thinks you will enjoy the video on your screen, so you should definitely click it and find out for yourself.